Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be listening to us. This is the Undivide Project Podcast, Changemakers Edition, where we have fascinating conversations with people who are doing their very best to help public, people, and planet. My name is Monica, and I'm your host, and I am so excited to have a justice conversation with Wendy Nystrom. Wendy, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I love what you are doing with the Undivide Project and the communication, education, outreach you are doing with your group.
Thank you. That's our for the planet piece of it, is we want to get out there and have as many people having the kind of conversations we're going to have today. And I said, everyone starts with an origin story. And it's particularly pointed because at some point, right now, people are listening to this as an audio cast, but we are going to re-release this as a video cast, which means folks will get to see your Wonder Woman mug at some point. And so every superhero, every hero has an origin story, something in your life that was a cataclysmic moment that made you say, I want to take on this grand challenge. So I'm excited to hear what your origin story is.
Sure. I'm complicated, actually. So I'm a geologist and geochemist by degree. I took my first geology class in the 8th grade. I went on geology trips as a kid, so I was super into rocks and the environment because I wanted to know how things happened. Why is there a mountain there? Why is there a stream there? Why are there deserts? I was perpetually asking why. And then I moved into the environmental world. So I was a field geologist and I saw the pollution, contamination, all the groundwater contamination happening with, pulling up a baler full of oil. And I thought, this is bad. Like, you don't see it when you're walking across a field, but underneath is a ton of contamination. And I transitioned over to insurance because I actually wanted to start helping people. I saw people with contaminated land losing their entire life savings because one, they either didn't know it was there, it's from the 30s or the 40s or before their time, or an accident happened, a leak happened. They're not malicious people, but an accident happened and it's hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars to clean up. So the insurance side was pollution and environmental insurance, so specialized coverage for such releases. And I spent a good 20 years in that industry. And it's a very difficult industry, especially for women or people of color. After 20 years of that, I was pretty much done with that world. And I wanted to go back to my environmental roots. And I really wanted to go back to actually helping people. And by helping people, I thought, okay, I had no clue. It was basically one foot in front of the other. What am I going to do? I went back to school. I enrolled at UCLA's certificate program, studied sustainability from the ground up. Had an amazing teacher, Nurit Katz, who really just engaged everyone. Like, she's a spectacular human being. And she really taught us the roots up of what sustainability is and let us choose the path. And for me, I focused a lot on the social injustices I saw in the world, in addition to a lot of wildfire, because I live in California, and energy burden. People don't know what energy burden, that means you can't afford your electric bill. You can't afford to heat or cool your house, which is what we're facing. And social justice became so important to me because I wanted to level that playing field for everyone, to have equal access to education, to certain products, certain rights. And I started my own webcast, Environmental Social Justice. Through that, I interview people talking about new technologies or the charities they're working on or 501c3s, basically bringing that information to the general public because as a scientist, we were always using jargon and acronyms and talking above people. I'm like, we got to stop using jargon. We got to stop using acronyms. We need to talk to the general public in a simple, concise manner. And that's when I also learned that if you don't understand it, what you're talking about, you cannot explain it simply. And I learned quickly how many people are kind of faking it, pretending to be environmental experts or ESG experts. And when you kind of dig down and like, could you explain that simply? Like, talk to me like I'm 5. That is my passion.
There's a few things in there to unpack. There is this following the trend, because with the trend goes the money and the opportunity. And so in a capitalist society, people are incentivized to follow the trend, but not realizing that that also is a kind of burden on communities because you have people who don't have the capacity to follow the trends. But a lot of times when that takes place, the most divested communities don't reap the benefits of this. How does ESG even hit the ground in the most underserved communities when we're talking about justice?
So when people talk about ESG, it's environmental, social, and governance. And they often think, oh, environment, planet, friendly, yay. And then governance is, politics and your internal workings of your own company. They forget about the people, the social side, the individual, the workers. And, I just posted today Back in 1965, the ratio of CEO pay was 20 times higher than the average worker. 2021, it was 399 times than the average worker. So we're seeing this pay disparity happening, which is why we are pretty much killing our middle class. That doesn't happen in other countries. This is just primarily a United States thing. And we need to kind of do a Control-Alt-Delete, restart things to make it a little more equal because, great, you're a CEO, you're probably very smart, you probably take on a lot of responsibilities. I get it. But if you don't have workers that are happy and treated fairly, you don't have a company because everything that happens in your company is by your workers.
Right. And the concept of pay and benefits, and again, as we're interrogating terminology that's just out here, work-life balance,
yeah,
determines the quality of life. Like there is a CEO, particularly in some of these companies that are acting as like pseudo-governmental entities because they have so much outsized influence over not just our economy, but our access to infrastructure, have a moral imperative to think about how their work actually hits communities, which is a facet of justice. Because oftentimes, particularly in this, when you're talking about in between CEOs and the average American, and the average American's ability to do some sort of remediation, if we're just talking about climate justice or energy or any of these things, the ability to remediate some of that is as simple as something you brought up when we were in our preview conversation, to be able to afford things or not. Afford things like to pay your power or water bill or your internet bill.
To have internet.
To have it. Versus to have a super yacht with its own Wi-Fi.
And a helicopter. And don't forget the dinghy.
Don't forget the dinghy. It's this disparity that we're talking about. And the burden that that lifestyle puts on the environment versus the people who are working in these companies, for example. It's like, how do we start solving that? And I think the first part of it is getting to awareness, which you're doing a lot of work around this. You mentioned your podcast, and so I want to talk more about what led you to start that podcast.
That's another long story.
And how do we build out more awareness about the way these disparities play out before we talk about some other things like energy justice and environmental justice, but just on the communication around the disparities?
The podcast got started during COVID because I pretty much finished UCLA. I was like, I'll just get a job, any job, just get a job in ESG or sustainability. That wasn't happening. Everything was locked down. And I thought, okay, what am I going to do with myself? And I was on a friend's podcast, I think 20 minutes in lockdown, and he would just interview people because we were, on that 2-week break that turned into
2 weeks to stop the spread, right?
I thought, I can do this. I'd never done a podcast in my life. I've never even really watched or heard podcasts before. But I thought, what a great way to basically kill time during COVID. So I started my podcast not knowing what to do. I had no clue what to do. I grabbed 2 of my friends, lifelong friends of mine, to join me. And it started off with us talking about current events, which was boring, so dull. And I thought, wow, I'm putting myself to sleep. So I started reaching out to my network. And because people were also similarly bored, I got NASDAQ, I got Moody's, I got Toyota, I got Hyundai, but I also got startups and entrepreneurs to be guests. And I'm forever indebted to people like NASDAQ and Moody's and Toyota, Hyundai. Those guys gave me some credibility by showing up. I started to get the attention of these startups and entrepreneurs, and these new technologies coming out are fascinating. And I thought, nobody knows about these guys. So I'm going to start promoting them and telling people, the world, about these things that they're doing, like pure Halbach ray technology, which is magnetics. Who's heard of that? Very few people. But it's a great green energy resource. And in addition to the solar and the wind that we already have, we need diversification of our energy. We have to have multitudes of options. That was really what launched me into doing this, is I wanted to let people know what was out there. And about social injustice, I talked to a lot of 501c3s. I'm now on the board of a group called Girl Plus Environment, which helps lift Black and brown girls' voices in the world so they are heard. They also do the main event, and it's MANE for hair, because women of color, the straighteners they're using are actually harmful to their endocrine system.
Yes.
And she's bringing that awareness out. She's visiting beauty parlors and she's visiting women in communities saying, please stop using any kind of product that has this stuff in it. Don't use that. And that's just for women's health. So the more talking, the better. The more people like you, the better. We just have to keep doing what we're doing.
Thank you for sharing that, because that is All great. And I hope all of your first guests at the Moody's and the NASDAQs came around and listened to the next batch of guests
Somehow.
who we're talking about. Because in terms of the ability to shift markets, that is what they do, whether they think that's their first line of business or not, but that is what they do. And I really want to go to, we're talking about social injustice, talking about 501c3s, where many times women, I mean, we're sitting here as two women who are in this fight. It is women who will go to the solution with full appreciation for the fact that we are also living on the front lines of the problem. You know, I think there's an evolution of terms when we're talking about environmental justice, climate justice. I even say digital justice sometimes in my work, but they're all intertwined and they all fall on the heads disproportionately of Black and brown folks who are women. And what is it about women?
That's a big package to unpack. I just had this conversation recently where they say, well, you know, girls mature faster than boys. True. But then we're not allowed to be the leaders. Interesting. They say that, you know, we're too emotional. Well, there was a study done in England many years ago. I can dig up the source. But basically, it was in England, and they took a group of 10-year-old boys and a group of 10-year-old girls, and they taught them things like cooking, cleaning, taking care of themselves, and then they put them in houses separately. Let's see what happens for a week. Boys went total Lord of the Flies. They had food fights, they ate junk food, they made a mess. The girls, within the first couple of days, actually, let me restate, I think it was a month, not a week. But the girls initially, yeah, they had little cat fights and they had little bickering sessions. And then they organized. You're in charge of cleaning, you're in charge of cooking, you're in charge of education, you're in charge of organizing. And all of a sudden, they had a whole little system. They had sit-down dinners together. They created a society. And yet we're not the leaders. Very interesting fact. So that's another thing I push for is, you know, coming from corporate insurance, I kind of saw quite a few people getting promoted. A lot of it had to do with who you were related to, so there was nepotism. But I saw a lot of people that I was treated very differently. And a perfect example is, oh, I'm going to go there, yes. There was...
Go there.
There was this young kid that is trained fresh out of college. Great kid, hard worker. Like, I was blessed to get him because I had no choice in hiring him. They just said, here's so-and-so, train him. I'm like, great. Hard worker, good kid. I noticed almost immediately when he came into the office, all the executives came out of their offices. Who are you? Where'd you come from? Oh, let's talk. Let's hang out. These were people in the 3 years I'd already been at this company, never said a word to me, never acknowledged me, never looked at me. And I was not only working as an underwriter and handled the entire West Coast by myself for this product line, I was speaking at conferences. I was teaching continuing education classes on pollution and contamination. No one cared. In fact, I had a manager say, you do nothing special.
Wow.
Yeah. So I was like, very interesting. And it did sour me. And again, not the kid's fault. I never treated him differently about it. But I was just like, shame on you, the senior staff, for completely falling over yourselves because this new kid walked in and they invited him to like golf things. I'd never been invited to the golf thing ever. And within his first 2 weeks of being with the company, I was speaking at a conference on behalf of my company. And he calls me, says, how do I get to such and such golf club? I'm like, what?
Wow.
I'll leave it at that. That was just one of many personal experiences.
And, you know, I'm sure that as people, and particularly women, are listening, the unfortunate truth is that we can fill in the blanks of how that story went and how his transition went, because that's relatable to so much of our experience.
Oh, yes. And I'm a huge advocate for the LGBTQ community as well, because I had a colleague, me, in charge of the Pride Month at my company. And I said, you know, hey, we're going to do colors. And he said, you know, I am gay, but don't tell anybody because I don't want to get fired. I was like, I will keep your secret. I will not say anything. But wow, that still happens.
Yes. I say this in Spanish in our bilingual household because we don't have a word in English that captures the same spirit. It's called negandeando, kind of like negate, erase, remove someone's whole experience. And so as soon as you said that, I was like, a series of phrases that were saying, like, I know what was happening to her in that moment. I know as that young man ascends, through no direct action of his own, what will continue happening to her and other people surrounding him. And then when you brought up the LGBTQ plus community, when we talk about anything justice oriented, there's a spectrum. Unfortunately, I'll say there's a spectrum of suffering
Yes,
And no matter what we're talking about, if we're talking about environmental justice, when you go to a community that has the most contamination, the most pollution, who lives there
exactly.
in the worst conditions with the least capacity to participate in public debates
Yes,
about it or participate in society about it? And then when you go global, the situation only declines with whether you're talking about a middle, low, or extremely low income country, particularly when you're talking about that group of people, because in some places it's unlawful for them to exist. So in American context, we have people being afraid to lose their livelihood. In other contexts, we have people that by law say you shouldn't actually be. But then you have to solve all these grand challenges at the same time.
You know, when you talk about contaminated land and people who are the higher percentage of exposed to pollution, yes, it is Black and brown communities. It was redlining where people were allowed to buy their homes. And it's just continued, even though it's 50, 60 years later, it's continued to progress that way because it was basically an imbalance of generating wealth. People say, oh, just move out of your neighborhood. It's like, well, 60 years ago, we were allowed to live here. The property value is still lower than it should be. Whereas this other family was allowed to live anywhere they chose, and their property value went up. So they were able to build on wealth. So this is a long-term problem. And of course, there isn't one solution. There's going to have to be multiple solutions. And personally, coming from an environmental standpoint, power plants that are belching out pollution should just be retired. It's a slow transition, but we can do it thoughtfully. We can do it carefully because when you have solar, when you have wind, I'm a huge hydrogen fan personally. I think hydrogen's fantastic. There are multitudes of other things we can do. The pure Halbach array magnetics, great technology right there. Is everything perfect? No, they all have their drawbacks, which is why we diversify. But when people say, leave the power plants alone, et cetera, what do you love about air pollution? What do you love about smog? 8 million people die a year just from air pollution. How about that? Can we just start with a really simple one right there?
We lose human beings at this rate. And we live in a capitalist society. We talk about access to capital and capacity to produce. Every one of those people, even if you don't care about social justice, and there are some people who just don't,
Oh, I know.
but care about productivity, every one of those 8 million people is a lost opportunity.
Oh, yeah. I mean, one of those 8 million people could have been the next Albert Einstein. I mean, a gift from God, brilliance, or a Picasso, we would never know.
We won't ever know. One of those 8 million people could just have been someone who worked or started a business and maintained that for their whole lives. And that's a loss to our GDP. For those of us who do care about social justice, we need to get out of the business of throwing people away.
Yes.
Because we can, because it's the short-term decision. Because to your point, about redlining, and I'm watching and I love the studies and the journalism that are coming out to sort of daylight this issue. The thing that people don't understand is that while folks were redlined into certain spaces and could only buy their home in certain areas, it wasn't just to separate certain undesirable groups that the majority did not want to socialize with. People are also pushed into heavily industrialized areas during redlining, or those communities were targeted for certain types of activities. So it's not an accident that the most redlined areas are where power plants are, where we get the term overburdened community. Or when you were talking about some of this contamination that was from the 30s and 40s, just across the river from where I live in DC, on one side of the river, the Anacostia community during World War II got the munitions factory and all of the contamination that comes with the munitions. And then farther down the river, they got the refueling infrastructure for during World War II. We were still using the Anacostia and the Potomac for military and industrial waterways. On the other side of the river, folks got the torpedo factory where they just made the outside of the torpedo. Hard work, not the same as making the munitions and having the refueling depots on the other side of it.
Yes. Very different things. Very different levels of pollution.
People in Anacostia just started learning last summer, and let me give some shout outs to some of my students at Georgetown and their colleagues at the University of District of Columbia, with help from Esri, did some mapping and some remote sensing work to help people understand what was underneath them, because they never knew that there was a fuel depot there.
Yeah. What'd they find?
No one really knows the state of how they were capped or not.
Probably not.
Probably not, because most of the records belong to the Department of Defense or are in historical records, and this is how they figured out where they were. Also came to understand, and by doing some research of what the recipe for the munitions is also something that's difficult to track down. And some of it is just records were just lost, but you can look at some typical I'm going to use recipes or chemical makeup or what was in them, to say them in simple language, as you're saying. What was in the stuff? What was in the ground? And almost half of the things that we use to make munitions are carcinogenic. And so you've got that in the ground with a heavily red line neighborhood that, of course, has an urban heat island effect. And in today has a concrete factory that's in the middle of the neighborhood. And it historically has always been a mostly Black as well as Eastern European immigrant community. And to this day, that's still the bulk of who lives there. Everybody has some health issue.
Well, it's in their groundwater. I mean, when they say it's buried underground, it's in the groundwater.
When we start talking about what are our responsibilities as communities, good responsible research to hand this over to the communities as maps, as visualizations in ways that they can understand it and communicate it, as opposed to resisting the temptation to put it in some 60-page journal document that no one can read or understand, and give it to them this way to give them the chance to ask those questions. But you say we take a holistic approach. Let's go there. Let's be daring. Like, what does justice look like for communities like that? The hard decisions we have to make.
First of all, doing the research and your students finding that information and giving it to the community, that's exactly what you do. Resist the temptation of publishing in a journal that no one's going to read. Resist the jargon and acronyms. A company I'm now working with, Navigating Gray, one of the things they are focused on is taking those reports and simplifying it so everyone can understand. Basically creating a translator, because people hide behind the jargon, they hide behind the acronyms, hoping no one will ask questions because they're too afraid to. And a lot of these communities, they will be afraid. They don't want to cause trouble. Let's just keep it simple. All of this information needs to be released. In the 1940s, when you did have waste, a lot of it was not properly contained because they just didn't know. I doubt it was malicious or, to hell with it, we're just going to dump it. I think it was more along the lines of, this is our normal. Dump it in the back 40, it's going to go away. I mean, there was a phrase, the solution to pollution is dilution. So hose it down. And they just didn't know. That's why we have Superfund now. We have the EPA now, because people realized in the 60s and 70s, we've got a problem. We realized these are bad. And so that's why the EPA is identifying these sites and cleaning them up, and also creating new regulation of new concentrations. So what was considered clean before, they're like, that's not really clean. We're going to have to drop that level down to reportable down here, which is a burden to people, hence insurance, a burden to people to reopen sites to clean it up some more. Again, multiple answers, multiple problems, but just keep pushing forward. One of the things when you ask me my origin story, it's hard what I do because sometimes it's not popular. I get yelled at a lot. But I always think Tyler Perry, I'm a fan of his, and he always said, if they're not going to invite you to the table, build your own table. And ESJ, I built my own table. Because if someone wants to yell at me, they're yelling at me. They're not yelling at some boss. They're not yelling at someone superior to me. Yell at me all you want, but I'm going to keep continuing with explaining to everyone what's out there, what's happening, what the conditions are, and how to fix it. We need to focus on positive. In the news and the media, so many people, for the love of God, please stop putting some woman on a beach and holding up plastic and saying, oh, we got a plastic problem. We know. How about bringing in a scientist, geologist, to say, here are the solutions we have at hand. Here is what we can do to make things better and to start acting. I keep telling people the time to act is now. No more conferences, no more meetings, no more summits where you have 400 private jets flying in for a networking event. We know the solution. We just have to actually implement it.
I agree with you. These talk fests, which some countries have stopped attending because they've realized that that's just what they are. And even in that, there's injustice.
Oh, absolutely.
COP27 was in a resort town in Egypt that is extremely difficult to get to. Even if you're from Egypt and you know where you're going, not the easiest place to get to. And if you're someone who really needs the solution and wants to talk about it, it's very difficult to get to. Expensive to go and be there. Or the World Economic Forum is in some ski resort town. So what does that say about the seriousness of having real conversations about justice? And yes, I probably just got disinvited, or anyone who was ever thinking about inviting me to one of these things is now saying no. And I'm okay with that, actually, because nothing's accomplished. We're getting into what I'm calling climate change and disaster porn, where we like to put these pictures up to show how bad it is, or show these videos or make these documentaries. It's a disservice, because I think what it does is overwhelms people,
Scares them
to where they think that there's nothing that can be done, or there's no documentary about what the solution is.
Yeah, funny that. It's the eco-anxiety. When I first started ESJ, Environmental Social Justice, here I am catching myself in acronyms. I was told, oh, you'll never be popular because you need to slap people or turn over tables. I'm like, I don't do that. I don't pick fights. That's just not me. With the eco-anxiety, I've had many people with children in their 20s who are devastated, thinking the world's going to end. Why bother? Some people will cry themselves to sleep at night. And I've always said to them, have your kid call me. I will talk to them. Because yes, we're in a bad situation, but we can fix it. COVID was a great example when all those factories shut down and the air cleared up. Mind you, still the upper atmosphere had issues, but the air cleared up. We could see a difference quickly. So we know it's possible. And we have to focus on that possibility.
I agree with you. And those of us of a certain age can probably remember acid rain, being anxious about this huge hole in the ozone layer. And we don't talk about the status of that hole in the ozone layer, or how we got to the place to where it's not a threat anymore. And a lot of it was, we used science, we believed scientists.
Crazy.
And private industry did its part, which was took the science and engaged in advertising campaigns and told us what to do. Sort of like, it's the CFCs. And so we're going to ask you all to stop using certain products, and we're going to stop putting certain products in certain containers, and we're going to stop using certain chemicals. And this is the way forward. But there was a point in time when you were worried about acid rain, and we don't anymore. And so we should know to look at our recent and less recent history that we can do this. But I agree with you, is that we're not communicating it in a way.
We have to promote the positive, because if people are only bombarded with the negative all the time, then you feel powerless. I can't do anything. Why bother? My favorite, I'll be dead by then. Who cares? Great attitude. We have to focus on the solutions, what we can do, little changes. I met someone a couple months ago. He's in his 70s. He said, I'm not going to be able to make any real change in my life, so what do you recommend? And I said, stop buying stuff you don't need. Over-consumerism. That's huge. It hits industry, manufacturing, shipping, greenhouse gas emissions, everything. Stop buying stuff you don't need. He said, that's it? I said, yeah, just do that. That'll make a huge change, actually. Over-shopping, over-consumption.
All of those things, because we're past it now. But when we drop these podcasts as video cast on our YouTube channel over the holidays in the United States, you can go back, because our first episode was deliberately released when the UNGA and New York, Paris, and Milan Fashion Week were intersecting, where the messaging of TalkFest and encouragement to reach for things that you do not need, to be honest, are nice to look at, but have zero functionality in your real life. Probably not going to be sponsored by some fashion company, maybe a sustainable one, but not that. And that's okay. And this drive to buy stuff, because that's what those weeks are. They are week-long advertisements to buy things, to be flash in the pans for consumerism. And it's happening alongside another one of these talk fests, because General Assembly is a conversation forum. It is not a space where decisions are made. Decisions are actually made in federal, state, and local government.
Yeah.
A question I said I was going to ask for you is like, I'm in the DC area. Let's pretend that we could have a working group, a working conversation with policy writers. What would be on your wish list? They ask, like, well, what can I do?
I'll try to narrow my wish list down. Number one, because I do work with fire victims and wildfires, most people don't know there's a law in the books that if you get a settlement and you lose your home, you lose everything. That's taxable income. So let's get rid of that. You lost everything. Whatever settlement you got, let's say it's $1 million. Awesome. You're taxed on that. You should not be taxed. That should be removed. That's my number one, just helping families. And two, we have the technology, we have the knowledge, we have the brilliance out there. Build it. Stop talking about it. Stop arguing over it. Stop with the politics of it. Stop with these bills that are sent that are 6,000 pages long because there's one thing you're pushing, but then you're going to bury in a whole bunch of other stuff. Can we simplify that? Can we just make things simple again and say, we want to pass a bill to repair our infrastructure? Great. Let's actually do that. Let's build things. Let's put people to work. Let's rebuild our bridges that are crumbling and falling apart. Let's do it sustainably with materials that make sense. There's a lot of tech out there with new concrete. A company called Bellaterra. They've got basically green concrete that's affordable. Start using things like that. Do things differently. Think it through. If you hate the word sustainability, fine. Just say, do the right thing. Do the right thing for the world, the planet, the people. Just do what's right. That's my narrowed version. I could probably talk a long time about everything I want.
I think all of those are great. So tell me, where can our listeners find you? Where can they find their podcasts? Where can they find your podcast? Where can they engage with you on social media and other spaces?
So everything is environmental social justice, all one word. So the handle on YouTube is environmental social justice. It's on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn. So you can also find me under Wendy Nystrom Lloyd, Lloyd. I hyphenated my married name, but I didn't officially change it. Never did the paperwork. So yeah, paperwork was too much. And I'm like, not doing it.
Another pitch for simplification.
Simplification, even simple folks. So I'm very active on LinkedIn. And I think on Twitter, it's like ENV_SOC_justice because they limit how many letters you can have. But I'm pretty easily found under environmental social justice and then Wendy, and I'll pop up, hopefully. I'm open to anyone who wants to reach out, talk, chat. Feel free to reach out to me. You can email me through LinkedIn, YouTube, comment. I even have a website, environmentalsocialjustice.com. It's just that one word.
You are findable, and we'll make sure all of that makes it into the show notes and that you get tagged.
Oh, thank you.
On our social media. Thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. It went way too fast, but I suspect we'll have others.
I hope so. You're a pleasure to talk to. You are a delight.
Likewise. It gives me such joy to be able to do this podcast because I view this as not simply a broadcast, but an opportunity to engage and help co-create communities of practice amongst everyone that I've gotten to meet on this journey and engage with on all these spaces, because we engaged on LinkedIn and through a Medium magazine and a few other fora, as is the case with many of the guests and people that you all will hear on the Undivided Project podcast, Changemakers Edition, because we have a lot to do. And the only way forward is together.
Absolutely.
All of Wendy's information, you heard it here on the recording, but it's also going to be in the show notes and we'll tag. You can find this podcast on Apple, Spotify, Google, Deezer, and everywhere that you like to listen to podcasts. Save the date because over the holidays in the U.S., it will be a video cast so that you can see everyone's beautiful faces and rewatch or re-listen to anything that fascinated you on our YouTube channel. Follow us on all of our socials. It's simply at Undivided Project on all channels. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to engaging with you all next time.